as well as youth and community allies to fight for equity for Asian American and Pacific Islanders. And our mission is really to advocate for equity and opportunity for most marginalized AAPI children and families here in New York.
So we wanted to start off with an acknowledgement in the space of the current harms and violence in Palestine and in Israel, the important historical context of the region, and the repercussions and the lack of safety experienced across Middle Eastern, South Asian, Muslim, Sikh, and Jewish communities, and more right here in New York.
And we aim to really create a safe educational space that promotes open dialogue around the root causes of the systemic issues that our communities face, both in the US and abroad, but including in these heightened, painful times. The detrimental effects of these instances of hate on the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of our vulnerable and marginalized population highlights larger, pervasive social issues that must be addressed.
So in seeking real solutions, we must be willing to consider and challenge the status quo of the responses in our current justice system, which are centered on punishment and militarization. And we must create viable alternatives in order to create necessary improvements that rebuild and repair the collective safety of our communities.
So we invited our guest speakers today in the fields of restorative justice and hate prevention to really understand alternative methods that promote individual and community-wide healing while advocating for systemic change.
So before we begin, we wanted to go through a couple of community agreements here as we share the space. So we've asked folks to come into this space with curiosity and openness. And of course, please feel free to take care of yourselves if you need to step away or turn off your camera. This meeting is being recorded, and so we will share it as well as any resources that are shared during the meeting. We'll share them with you in an email after, so you can watch and access the resources shared during this webinar.
Of course, and we want to remind each other that we want to give grace to ourselves and others as we come into this space, and remind that in order for us to grow, sometimes we need to lean into that discomfort.
Logistics in terms of questions, they can be directed to the chat, to the host, and what we'll do is share them with our moderator, who will facilitate a question and answer session after the panel. When preparing your questions, just please remember to speak from your own experience if you're sharing any experiences.
So it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Josie Han. Josie is a senior research fellow and social epidemiologist at the Brennan Center's Justice Program, where she leads and implements rigorous mixed methods research and racial equity approaches in the criminal justice system. And previously, she was the research director of the Racial Equity and Fairness at the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. And she's led numerous studies and reports at the Center for Justice Innovation and the Vera Institute of Justice. Josie was also a founding member of Common Justice, a restorative justice-based alternative to incarceration. She was a longtime educator, volunteered with young people and families in the criminal legal system for years. And I'm just so grateful that we have her today to help us in leading this discussion. Josie.
Thanks so much, Vanessa and Anita. I have been out of the restorative justice space for a while, so I'm so thrilled to be hearing from our speaker and panelists. So it is my privilege to first introduce my wonderful colleague, Hassan Naveed. Hassan is here along with our esteemed panelists because he partners with and for our diverse communities to address hate and violence, including in restorative justice work. In these ongoing challenging times. So just in brief, Hassan is the executive director of the New York City Mayor's Office to Prevent Hate Crimes. Previously, he served as the deputy executive director of OPHC. He is the director of outreach at the New York City Department of Investigation, Office of Inspector General. And prior to joining city government, Hassan led community efforts in Washington, D.C. to improve hate crime responses and prevention, in particular by the local police department, involving LGBTQ, Muslim, immigrant, and many other communities. Hassan, thank you so much for being here today. We know that you have to jump off quickly, so please take it away.
Thank you so much, Josie, and thank you so much, the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Hassan Naveed. I'm the Executive Director for the Office for the Prevention of Hate Crimes. I see familiar faces right now. I just need to I see Mika's here. I see a lot of familiar faces. Hey, it just goes to show that we have Felicia's here too. Okay. We have a community of people that have been in this field for a very long time, and that we're also working towards some great stuff that I'm happy to announce. But I also just quickly wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the current circumstances that we're in, that's happening in Gaza as well as in Israel too. And the climate that has really impacted so many communities. In the last couple of weeks, this has been the most challenging weeks for me. Last couple of weeks, 3 weeks now, in going to various communities and really hearing and feeling the fear and that communities are feeling at this moment, right, in this situation. We are seeing an increase in number of hate crimes, bias incidents that are impacting Jewish, Arab, Muslim, and other communities. We fund over 77 organizations throughout the city. It's one of the most diverse coalition of organizations. It includes all the way from Jewish communities in Williamsburg to transgender, gender nonconforming communities in the Bronx, right? And so we're looking at really taking these sort of organizations and doing this work on the ground. We'll get to that a little bit later on. But even with me going to engage with these organizations, they're also talking about underreporting. And I want to bring that up because what we're seeing in terms of the numbers and what's exactly out there is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because we know that underreporting is a systemic issue, underreporting when it comes to hate crimes from communities that are vulnerable, right? And so as we look at the numbers themselves, realize that that's just a definition. It's a definition that is applied by the NYPD based on state law, and that there are crimes that occur that may have bias elements that don't reach the threshold. And there might be other incidences of bias incidents that don't necessarily make it. But it's also important to check in with your friends and knowing that we're living in this atmosphere itself as well, too. The folks that are impacted by this issue directly. I think, in the last couple of weeks, I've called many of my Jewish, Muslim, and Arab friends to be able to check in and make sure to be able to listen, but also be prepared with resources as well. And so I'm going to share some resources a bit later on with some of the organizations that we work with. But also when it comes to mental health resources, we have the new line, 9788, the new line that's been launched as well, too, that I would recommend people also turn to for assistance as well. The list that I provide would be something that would be culturally responsive to communities. So our Jewish organization that we serve provide certain services as well around mental health. We have other Arab organizations that do the same, Muslim organization that can make referrals as well. We want to make sure we meet communities where they're at. Now for OPHC. We were founded in 2019. This was the first time any sort of city or government or entity really thought taking an issue that has impacted so many people, right, and has such a reverberating impact across, community just by one incident, and took it and turned it into an office, right, and brought it into the executive aspect of the office. So you can just imagine now this issue has been set at a level where it has the attention of the city, and it's also being funded. We sit with about $2.7 million of funding, and that money is spread out to 77 organizations. So we built an apparatus that didn't exist before of 77 organizations that now can say, we're going to work on hate crime prevention and response work, which is phenomenal. But that also involved us assisting with building capacity with them because these are small to medium nonprofit organizations. Think about it. The folks who are most impacted by hate crimes and the representation that they have in the nonprofit apparatus, right, that's culturally responsive to their needs, may not necessarily be the bigger ones, right, or likely not. And so we're working with these organizations to be able to build capacity and also fulfill some of that programming that's needed on prevention and, yes, response. I might be a prevention-oriented office, but we still had a great need for response in these arenas. Yes, we do prevention work in the schools. Yes, we do go out and be able to engage business ahead of time to be able to do upstander trainings or whatever it might be. But we still have situations where communities want credible messengers to be their go-to when it comes to filing a police report or police complaint, being able to get resources and services that are culturally responsive. And so the last 3 years has been something that's really built out quite a bit. And I'm going to share in the same list that was just shared right now, you can see the various organizations that we're funding and see sort of what the efforts and the work that they're doing as well. And getting into some of our restorative justice work, which we are now entering into, right? And we have a phenomenal opportunity that I wanted to share with folks as well, too. And this is, there are two people on here whom I can credit to this, Mika and Anuj, who I've had the opportunity to work with. But we, on sort of what we've come to now is we don't have a systemized, you don't have a systemized approach when it comes to restorative justice on hate crimes in the city. If it's anything, it's by very much a referral process that's on a case-by-case basis, and the DAs or whomever can end up sort of making their own sort of referrals in this process, right? But I think it's important that we look to see what that looks like in the bigger sense across the city itself. And it's something that the 77 organizations that I work with have expressed interest in, right? Because they've come to the table and they've seen the importance of why this is a way for us to be able to build, yes, seek restorative justice, but also build a relationship among communities themselves that are sorely needed, right? To be able to break some of those silos to be able to engage with each other collectively. And so the first opportunity is we have the community projects grants, which is something that we provide up to $5,000 to $10,000 of funding to organizations from January to June, in which they could end up proposing any project that seeks to address issues related to hate crime prevention and response, right? And so we've had situations where organizations have proposed particular restorative justice tactics as a mean to be able to community heal or bring people together in a neighborhood where there might be some tension or conflict among communities all these are wonderful ideas. And so I think that if you look at it itself, you'll see that one of our partners is the city's Commission on Human Rights. So we've really broadened our approach, not to just focus on the crime element, because if I did, how would we actually prevent everything else that leads to that, right? And so we wanted to be able to come up with a much broader approach. And that is one thing. And then last but not least is this amazing funding opportunity that I was talking about just earlier that's coming in from the Institute, it's MOCJ, but it's also, what is it called, in partnership with the CUNY Institute for State and Local Government. And we're seeking proposals to implement a community-based restorative justice program in New York City. And that is going to be roughly, we anticipate funding approximately 15 proposals of up to $300,000 per award across 3 categories. And the categories are listed in the solicitation or the link that was just shared by Vanessa. And so I want to thank you all for having me come. I don't want to take up too much time. I know that the panel is something that's very important. Some of my favorite people are on there. And, if there's any questions that folks have, any concerns, any sort of things that folks want to share, I maintain these open office hours. I know it's kind of rare that we have this, but I will share with you a link if you would like me to down the line where you can figure out a time that best works for you within the frame for me able to learn more about your work. I mean, if there's something that you have, if you work in the schools, I'm interested. We want to be able to really go in the innovative direction. The funding that we have is very, very flexible as OPHC, and I am not the one person who has the answers to all the problems. No. It involves community effort, people coming collectively together. So thank you all so much, and I'll put my contact info. If you could put my contact information in there, Vanessa, it'd be great. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hassan. We always appreciate your time and your leadership and how you always lead with community and are very real about that. He means it. It's true. Those are not just words, they're actions. Others can also confirm, but thank you so much for your time. We know that you have to run, but it was really good to share space with you. Thank you, Hassan. Take good care. Yeah, so once again, we are hearing from deeply respected guest speakers in the field of restorative justice and or how to address hate crimes and violence. We particularly want to understand what restorative justice is. How can restorative justice help us with tools and resources for our own settings, audiences, and communities? And what restorative justice looks like in people's organizations in different settings like schools, other systems and communities, as well as the impact. So those are just some of our framing questions. But first, I am actually really pleased to introduce our panelists. We have Nuj Bandari, who's a community organizer and an artist, whose passion is the relationship between community education and harm reduction practice, exploring alternatives to, diversions from, and the elimination of the carceral state. Recent campaign work includes the fight to end the school to prison pipeline, implementation of restorative justice in communities, and co-created work as a restorative justice coordinator with Bank the Road New York, as well as senior coordinator at the Restorative Justice Initiatives with MICA. As an artist, Anuj is an experimental theater maker and a performer. He's working with a number of different wonderful groups, but he's also currently a Bandung resident with the Asian American Arts Alliance and the Museum of the Contemporary African Diasporic Arts, and a 2023 McDowell Fellowship recipient of the Theater Arts. These are brief bios of incredible people, so bear with me. Next, we have Jane Shim. She is the director of the Stop Asian Hate Project at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Project. She supports Asian American communities on state and interpersonal violence and works to address root causes with communities. She was also previously an attorney at the Immigrant Defense Project. She worked on state and federal advocacy campaigns to fight the criminalization of immigrants, challenge policing practices in immigrant and low-income communities, and supporting non-citizens in prisons and detention. Before that, she was a litigation associate, and she's here with us. Oh, she's also a former Fulbright scholar in poetry, so love the co-creation on all fronts. And then we also have Terrence Winston, Executive Director of the Coalition for Community Schools Excellence. Terrence currently CCSE, is an educational advocacy program quality assessment and accountability group consisting of 70+ nonprofit organizations working from an anti-racist paradigm, supporting and serving the NYC Department of Education's community schools initiatives in 421 public schools that serve over 200,000 students across the boroughs. And for 30 years, Terrence has proudly raised and invested efforts in underserved and powerful Black and Brown communities, working diligently towards liberation and healing from oppressive systems, habits, and policies. Terrence works through consensus building, conflict resolution, mentorship, and engaging with elders and relationships with all people, people first, to improve social conditions. So just as a reminder, we are thrilled to have our panelists here, and per our community agreements, please be curious, open, and respectful. Please take care of yourselves and ourselves. Please give grace. Grow from the discomfort that we may experience here. Listen to understand and not to respond, and to please speak from your own experience. So I'm gonna do circle process with our esteemed panelists. My first question will be, very simply, what is restorative justice? Whoever would like to take the floor, please.
I'm happy to start on this. I'll also say, every time I talk about restorative justice, I feel like I have different words to use to talk about it. And so I'm sure that like with Jane and Terrence, we'll kind of be creating a mosaic definition of sorts. But for me, on a more technical level, restorative justice and restorative practices are a set of principles that come from Indigenous community, that are both able to provide us with thinking about alternatives to the punitive systems we have around us, but are really rooted in being able to deepen relationships and build like really a closer community. And so I think when I when I read this question, I really thought to myself, like, what are the things that are always present in my restorative justice practices, like in my life right now, as I define restorative justice, what are the things that are always in it? And the three words that kept coming up for me were consent, storytelling, and accountability. And so I'll also just say that for me, restorative justice is weaving those things together in community. I think for me, the consent piece, our current criminal legal system, our punitive systems work in a lot of ways where people don't have a say in their own outcomes, where people don't have a say in what happens to them, when people don't have a say in in moments where they are harmed or when they have hurt others. And I think restorative justice continually aims to provide spaces where people have say in the processes that they are involved with, and that there is transparency around what they're stepping into, right? I even think about, before bringing people together for Circle, how there's always transparency around what the questions are that are being asked, right? It's not a trial where you are being caught off guard by what is being asked, but rather you are provided with information to make informed decisions. The second part, storytelling, it involves an exchange, it involves a humanization, and I think this is really like one of the most beautiful parts of this practice for me. Is that I very much know that I will react to harm that happens outside of my home from a stranger very differently than the person who I love the most in the world. And I also know that storytelling is a pathway to be able to shifting that dynamic, to really being able to humanize the person sitting next to me. And then finally, accountability. And I think this is a huge one because there's a lot of definitions of restorative justice out there that don't involve like action after a restorative justice circle has taken place. But I think at all levels of restorative justice, accountability is present. In community building, it's accountable to like being in relationship to one another and wanting to build a better future together. In response to harm work, it's accountability to shifting the feelings of hurt and harm that exist, right? And if there's not action, there's not really a transformation of like human condition. And so it's not only being able to have like education and storytelling, it's also saying, now that we have that, what are the actions that we can use that can actually shift the conditions of how we live together? So that's I'll pause there, but for me, that's a lot of pieces and parts of my definition of restorative justice.
Thank you so much, Anush, for starting us off and being so clear in these beautiful descriptions backed up with actions and community and relationship building. Jane, Terrence, would you like to build on what is restorative justice to you?
Okay, I guess I'll jump in next. So I'm very moved by everything that Anush just said, which is just beautiful. I think for me, like, I guess I'll give a little background about what I actually do and like how that might relate to restorative justice, because I think the way I think about it is related to my role pretty specifically. So I think the most directly related responsibility I have is responding to people who have experienced some kind of racial harm or violence from the Asian American community. And so in terms of restorative justice, I think one thing that I have struggled with is Anush mentioned circles, and I think there's a process that has kind of been laid out by a lot of restorative justice practitioners that involves, the person who's harmed and the person who's been harmed, and there being a process for healing and accountability to happen. For me and for a lot of people who we work with, that the person who harmed is someone they don't know who they are. You're not able to find out who it was. They may never see them again. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is a neighbor or someone who is a loved one even, or a coworker or classmate. But I would say most of the time it isn't. And so I think one of the things we've been thinking about is focusing more on like those the values piece of like, how can we center this person's experience and give them tools or support to get to solutions in the absence of them being able to directly hold that person accountable, right? And I can talk a little bit later about like what types of things sometimes come up in that context. But I think one of the key things is something that I would just reiterate from what Anuj said, which is community building. So like one of the first things I try to do is like assess how much in isolation a person might be versus in community. So, you know, sometimes I talk to someone, they're like, oh yeah, my coworker like recorded the incident, like helped me like talk to the police officer and my family's, and you know, like just getting a sense of like, are they engaged with some type of support network or not? And if they're not, how do I connect them to an organization or people in their neighborhood who we've worked with before, to get them that more immediate sense of support. So I think like that relationship building part is a big part of how we think about it as well. And then the other thing I would say is we get like, you know, direct calls from people who may be in isolation, may not be associated with an organization, but another big thing we try to do is to just focus some of our racial harm intervention on working with the grassroots organizations that are already like actively engaged in strengthening communities, providing services outside of just, you know, when an incident like this occurs, and becoming kind of an ally or part of that network that's already existing and growing, to strengthen, you know, the project of kind of self-determination of communities and a self-created sense of safety.
Thank you so much, Jane, for sharing how you are building community and supporting folks where they're at, especially when they've experienced harm. And I should also be clear with the panelists, of course, consent is part of the process, so please also feel free to skip and pass. But yeah, we'd love to hear more about definitions of restorative justice. Terrence, feel free to jump in if you'd like to, and we can also, yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Josie, and you know, thank you to my colleagues on the panel. I do feel as though Anuj gave a fairly comprehensive definition. I think what I'd like to add is coming from a position of, and I'm not a medical practitioner, so let me make that disclaimer. But if we subscribe to, or if anyone subscribes to like Chinese medicine, illness is a indication of imbalance. So restorative justice seeks to establish some kind of balance that has been lost, either in the community or in a relationship. So that's and that requires great delicacy, because and that's when. So the shorter answer is it's a reclamation of balance that has been lost somewhere along the line, that has either led to harm or exacerbated a current harm, and it's unclear what the path forward is to essentially heal. So it's a healing paradigm. It's not a fixing one. So restorative justice is not about fixing. So it doesn't come from the attitude that people are somehow broken. And I think that something that Anuj spoke to that I'd like to expand upon a little bit is the idea of, give me a second, I lost it. People not having voice in their own, I don't want to misquote you, Anuj, but the comments you made are people not having agency or voice in the systems that impact them. That is not a uniform experience. And what I mean by that is, in my community, if I can use that language, I may have voice and agency, but when I step outside of my community, somehow that does not translate. And that's significant. So when, you know, in encountering people from communities, and there may be this judgment that they're somehow parochial in sort of their thinking and actions, it might be because within their sort of milieu, they have strength and power and understanding. But if they go into a community that does not, that actually it devalues sort of their entire experience, why would they want to be sort of in that community, and how could they function in that community without a mechanism like restorative practices to sort of support that engagement? So I think there's an advocacy piece also in restorative justice that is like that. It's a form of cultural assertion, depending on the context that you're in, which I think is important when you talk about sort of indigenous wisdom. It is a space where different cultural worldviews can be consciously brought forward to engage in a different sort of dialogue that will hopefully lead to a different series of outcomes for all participants. And this also ties back to the balance piece, because sometimes in the reclamation of balance, it can seem on the surface as imbalance is being created, meaning that you may center or elevate certain voices more than others. But that's not a fixed point. It can sort of evolve, and you will sort of find equilibrium somewhere along in the process if you're consistent and there's rigor and support in doing so, and resource in doing so.
Very beautifully said, Terrence, and all of you. Thank you so much for sharing what restorative justice looks like for you and your communities and in your work. I thought we could actually talk more about what concrete approaches to restorative justice look like in your different settings, in communities and schools, in addressing hate violence, for example. Tell us more about that. Whoever would like to share, please do.
I'm happy to. Oh, Terrence, do you want to start off?
I wanted to be fair this time, so since you were courageously stepped forward, so I'm thanks, Anuj. I don't really engage with sort of hate action per se, so I can't speak to that. We function as a coalition, really as a convener and as advocates. So I think that the statement, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I mean, people may walk away thinking I'm some kind of medical person. I'm really not. So maybe I should kind of move away from those metaphors. But we convene in spaces restoratively. And there are a couple of, I see one of my colleagues, Sonia Sasodia, who is a member of the coalition with us and also a member of the steering committee. Hello, Sonia, who actually is a participant, an active participant. And we try to do things, as many things as possible using a restorative framework. I think it's helpful because it allows us to engage in some really challenging topics where it's hard to arrive at consensus. So, and I think we've started to do, I think with familiarity and intimacy, we've created kind of a shorthand. And by no means am I it's encouraging that you should sort of shortcut a restorative process. Like there should be rigor and thoughtfulness around the agreements, around recognizing the tiers, around sort of circle keeping. So, and I'm kind of a stickler for that. But over time, with that commitment, it fosters a greater level of confidence in your ability to disagree with that, which hopefully will, ameliorate any situations that could lead to harm in the future. So I mean, I didn't think I would go this way with the direction, but we function restoratively as a preventative tool to harm or misunderstanding or mistrust. So that's the best way that I can answer that question in terms of how we engage.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that come to my mind. I think just to build upon what Terrence just said, like I think community building circles, which is like a specific tool that we use within restorative justice work, like that's kind of like my primary way of moving as a restorative justice practitioner, is really like building community spaces for people to come together and storytell around a specific topic or theme, with the knowledge that like as we do that, we're actively building skills that are preventing the occurrences of conflict or harm down the line, and simultaneously building skills to be able to work through it on an interpersonal level when things do come up. And so I do think like, first and foremost, I just want to name that like, I think a lot of us have a dream and goal within this practice that like, we aren't using restorative justice to respond to hate, we're using it to prevent it. And so I just want to like build off of what Terrence said. In that way, I think in thinking about a couple of specifics of like how I convene folks within response to harm work. So one of the things that I get to do through Restorative Justice Initiative is convene practitioners. And so bring people together around the city who are really thinking about what this work looks like in practice on a day-to-day level. And I think the reason why that's so necessary is like, hate is extremely simple in that it's a form of violence and a barrier to being able to build closer relationships. But hate is like extremely nuanced in that responding to it is not as simple as an equation. And so one of the things that I find over and over again is that practitioners throughout the city also need places to be in the deep questioning and investigation of this work together. And so one of the things that I like love to do most in this work is to convene restorative justice practitioners and to say, what are the questions that you feel like you're holding alone in this work right now? And how do we actually build a community where we're like supporting one another and providing a reflection space for like the emotional expression of all of those like questions we feel like we often have to hold alone, but also space to be like, cool, what tools can we build together? And in a way, like that process directly reflects other processes of how we might respond to harm in communities with restorative justice, right? That idea of like, well, what are the quiet questions here that we're not finding room and space to name? How do we really explore them together? And how do we decide where to go next from here? Like, I think there's this little like cycle in there of like, what's the world we have it right now? What's the world as we have it right now? What's the world that we dream of? And how do we leverage the realities of those differences? That like, I feel like all restorative justice circle, whether it's community building or response to harm, whether it's convening people that you are meeting, you have just recently met, or a group of practitioners you've been with for years, like frequently the restorative justice processes that I'm in kind of are in that cycle of like, let's work together to be as honest as possible about the world as we have it, the world as we dream it, and really what we can do to leverage that, leverage what we know about the differences between those. And so just to name like a lot of my work specifically, like as like a response to harm facilitator has taken place in the youth justice space, and really bringing together young people to be able to experience like building closer relationships and the transformation of harm. I think one of the direct tools that I want to name in that, I used to be the restorative justice coordinator at Make the Road New York, and I had two like posters in my office, one that said, what do we seek when we hurt others? And then the other that said, what do we seek when we are hurt? And at the end of our restorative justice circles, our students would write down words on each of those. And so they were just like ever-growing lists, but the lists were the same. Like these lists just read exactly the same. I could have switched the titles and like both lists still would have been applicable. And I think A, that illustrates like harm happens in cycles, but B, a direct tool to offer within thinking about how restorative justice works is that you need time to listen in to like the value or the need that is absent or being challenged. Like I think a lot of times in responding to harm, if we're able to find the root value in community that isn't being met or isn't being fulfilled or is being harmed, you can really think about a whole conversation around that. You know, if there's a feeling that people aren't safe and secure, then we can use the circle space to think, what is the conditions of like safety in the world around us right now? When do you feel safe? When do you feel unsafe? What is the dream for the world around us? What would safety look like if it was up to you? And then really think like, are there ways to support each other in moving from this to that? Yeah, so it's like a little bit of like a broader stroke of like supporting restorative justice practitioners, but also a little bit about like what my work with young people looks like across the city. So also just throw out there, like I think in restorative justice, in restorative justice initiative, one of our goals is to support people where they're at any point in their restorative journey. And what that has meant is, outside of my like direct practitioner work, there's also conversations across like all of these different sectors. And we realize restorative justice as a thing that every human in the world has the potential of building a relationship to, and also exists within our human condition. And so a lot of my work on a day-to-day basis is also just having these like really dreamy brainstorming conversations with people from all across the city that are like, what could this look like? And really being like, yeah, what can it look like? So, yeah.
I really like what Anu just said about restorative justice being something that's like kind of within us, because I think of something that we hear a lot is like the desire for like revenge or vengeance is something that's kind of like within us as people. So I think to the extent that anyone believes that to be true, I think you have to make the same argument that on the other side, like the desire for healing and vulnerability and connection is also something very human. So in our, I guess, yeah, I mean, our work is a little different in that, like I said before, we are talking to people who may not be in a strong community and dealing with harm that may not have happened within kind of like a strong or set or definable context. That means it could have been on the street, public transportation, everything. Sometimes it is with a neighbor, but like, you know, in a situation that it's not a super tight-knit thing, or it's not a thing where the person who's contacting me feels particularly comfortable calling on the other people who live directly near them or whatever it is, just because they may not know them very well. And so like that poses challenges, right? Because I think one common thread has been like, okay, calling on the relationships we have and the community that's in place to respond, or like strengthening that community so that it's able to respond when harm happens. Well, like, you know, I'm kind of working in like an imperfect moment, right? If you're taking that framework. So like I said before, I think one of the concrete things we do is very much like how, like, I'm only one person, but how do I first and foremost do my very best to stand in for a type of support that this person may be lacking, right? Like, I'm not a whole community. I don't live anywhere near this person necessarily. Sometimes I'm talking to somebody who doesn't even live in New York State, lives in a completely different place. But if they are living in some kind of isolation, the thing I hear more than anything that's completely consistent is just like, thank you for taking that 2 hours to just hear me. Like, that I feel so validated. And it's like, when you have no community, having a person or an organization that's going to follow up with you, who's maybe, you know, we try to, even for people who are in places that don't have a lot of there's a big Asian American populations, if that's the type of community someone is like looking for in response to racial harm, like, who do we know? Like, who knows, like a family member of a friend of a whatever, because I think like it's a vulnerable time where like we're kind of linked up to somebody who is reaching out, and like that's a real opportunity for someone to maybe get linked into a local community that can be built up, that can support them moving forward. So that's like one like example, I guess, or a case study of a sort of like how I think about that approach. And then another kind of concrete example is like, you know, we're a legal organization, and I think a lot of times people call us because they are outraged and disappointed at what the criminal legal system, how they have responded or failed to respond or duplicated the harms or tried to arrest the person reporting the whatever it is. I mean, that's more common than someone feeling like they had a good experience with the police by far. And they're like, what can I do about it? Like, you're a lawyer, you're a legal organization, like, help me. I think there's like an abstract idea that like, help me, this can't be legal, you know? What can I do about it? And I think, unfortunately, in most situations, the legal responses are very limited or non-existent, right? That's just kind of the reality for a lot of types of incidents that we're responding to. And so, you know, I don't kind of like leave it there and say, okay, like, sorry, like the law's not great in this area. I'm like, okay, as someone who you're calling on to give you some sort of sense of the legal world, I can tell you its limitations, but then I also feel like I have a responsibility to tell you what else is available to make you feel safe, because you're experiencing the failure of the agency that's supposed to keep you safe. And so, you know, if I speak to someone who's been experiencing an attack on public transit that they have to rely on every day to get to work, I say, would you be interested in just, you know, kind of in this time, like as you're feeling really not great out in public, having someone pick you up from work because you work nights and you don't like want to, you know, drive on your own, or like, I try to figure out, is there an organization that's like has an office in their area that can do that type of work, or can we find volunteers who can do that type of work? Like, even if like we can't get that police officer who treated them badly in responding to the incident, like fired from their job because of the way the law is set up, like that can be so much more valuable to that person's sense of safety than having them go through some super protracted, like awfully administrative complaint process, you know? So that's like, those are, I guess, two kind of examples of how it plays out in the day-to-day for us.
Thank you so much, panelists. We are learning so much from you all, and we really appreciate just your sharing your wisdom and your experiences so concretely. One clarification question we actually have is for those of the folks that are less familiar with restorative justice circles, can the panelists just talk through what a restorative justice circle is in your practice? You know, what happens really quickly, just to dig further into that.
So, I mean, I'm happy to tackle that question. I think that, and this is reinforced in some of the literature that's out there, but when I work with people who are new to the restorative process, from a technical aspect, I break up restorative justice practices and circles sometimes are used interchangeably, and that is not always helpful. So I describe practices as the process, justice as the outcome, and circles as, excuse me, the mechanism in which folks convene to engage in restorative process. It is not mandatory to engage in restorative process sitting in circle. I will just say that. Some people may feel differently than that, and of course that's fine. This is not, I'm not saying this sort of in a spirit of compliance that you must do that. But when you sit in circle, you know, the schematic is designed so there is not one person sort of in power or at like a focal point, as if like at the head of the table or the apex of a triangle. So hopefully if in an ideal circle, people are equidistant from each other. Everyone can sort of see each other, so there are no obstructions. The circle is sort of anchored with a center piece, which could be a piece of fabric. And sort of within the centerpiece, there are talking pieces that are available that participants can either bring a piece of their own to you know, emphasize maybe their commitment to the process, and really sort of something that's a reflection of sort of like something of an intimate nature. And then that talking piece is sort of passed around either clockwise or counterclockwise, or what's called a popcorn style, where it can just be passed from person to person in a sort of a more haphazard manner. So the circle is the configuration of attendees or participants. There's a centerpiece, a talking piece is passed around, and finally there is normally what's called a circle keeper, who's responsible for initiating the dialogue in some instances, setting the ground rules, telling people what the purpose of the convening of the circle, and really to monitor the emotional climate of the circle to ensure that no additional harm is not being reinforced or recreated, and yeah, to make sure that there's hopefully some sort of harmony that's occurring in the process.
Thank you so much, Terrence, for clarifying an important mechanism for restorative justice, just one of the many tools, of course. So one question, I think we're hearing parts of it in a lot of what all of you are talking about, just in building, in supporting what safety looks like for people, self-determination. But could you tell us a bit more about what success looks like in restorative justice in your practices or communities? What does it look like in your experience?
I mean, I think one piece that comes to mind is like having the time and space to do it. I don't think we necessarily live in a society that like people have everyday schedules, or like we live in a world that's like set up for people to be able to participate in things that are as slow and relational as restorative justice processes. And so I think a piece of success for me is just knowing that we like took the time that healing deserves. Like, I think I never enjoy feeling like we had to expedite parts of a restorative justice process. So time and space is a big one. I think maybe this also like goes along with the question around like, well, what does a circle look like? There's so if there's like the circle itself, which for me, if I'm gonna like generalize 3 chunks of a circle, there's like the relationship building and setting of community agreements. There's like questions and storytelling rounds, and there's like consensus building around where we go next. I think a successful restorative justice process for me also has like a pre-circle process where consent is built between participants, and afterwards where the next steps are checked in on, and that people know that there is an accountable community around them. I think if it's just the circle, we lose out on a lot of that. We lose out on letting people know that there's a community that's willing to continue to show up for them. And we lose the part about people's choice and agency to be there in the first place. So I think that those are some of the things that for me are unsuccessful, like things that I think of with successful restorative justice practices. I think another one that's like specifically with response to harm work is like you know, in the art world, I always say that like memory is a form of imagination. And so it's like we get to like use our memory to do so much creation. And as that intersects with restorative justice, that like often makes response to harm really difficult because there's no like single story of how an event took place. And so for me, as like a facilitator, a question that I ask myself is like, am I focusing on getting a right story or a deeper understanding of what of the harm people are experiencing? And I always try to move towards the latter. I think if we get stuck on this question of like, what's the perfect story or what's the quote unquote like right story, we'll never have a single answer for that. But there's this larger conversation to engage in around like, well, how are people here feeling and how do we transform those feelings? So those are some of the things that I think for me, I'm like, these are markers of a successful process. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anuj. I'm just sitting with what each of you are saying there. They're really powerful and also just trying to slow down. And so appreciate these reminders and just so much to grapple with. Jane Terrence, happy to hear about a bit more about positive experiences, what success might look like, if you wish.
Yeah, I mean, success is, and by no means do I mean to infantilize anybody that, but it's almost like if you've ever been in a kindergarten classroom, there's just there's a take that image with a well choreographed dance piece where everyone is sort of working in harmony with one another. And even in sort of moments of chaos, there's something about it that there's an underlying form that somehow makes sense. There's just room for everybody. That's what success looks like. And in the context of harm, there's a reclamation of a kind of trust and a willingness to sort of forbear to continue to sort of push through this. It may not look like the relationship, the community may not look the same again, but whatever iteration that's going to emerge, it's going to be good. It's going to be different, and that's okay. And there's an acceptance of that. I mean, it's complex, but I think it's rooted sort of in a rhythm and a harmony that's been established. That's what success looks like for me as a practitioner. And I know that something positive is happening, as opposed to when there's that rhythm is off, you can detect that as well.
I would say it's probably something like the person's threat level feeling reduced, or like some kind of like settling, maybe not full like restoration or feeling of safety. But I think if someone continues to be in kind of like a dangerous or harassment situation that they can't get out of, I think at a minimum what is good to see is like, okay, that person at least knows they can call on these people or call on us, or doesn't feel so isolated. And sometimes an outcome beyond that is like hard to kind of put your finger on. But
can I build on that really quick? I think another piece that's coming up for me with both Jane and Terrence's responses is like, I think like a successful restorative justice process like doesn't build sides. Like I think the function of a circle is really this idea of like all of us are here to unite around a common thing. And just a tool that I want to share around that, I know like a lot of times when I was working in schools, if there was a young person who was just like going through something and behavior was changing, or we saw them express a lot of like disinterest, we would have like a supportive community circle for them or put that out as an option. And one of the tools that we always had was that we would do a round where everybody would fill in the blank, like I am the person who will blank. And like in your relationship to this person, in your relationship to yourself, who are you? What is your commitment there? Like I'm the person who will call you in the morning to make sure you're out of bed and going to school. I'm the person who will sit beside you when you need a place to express yourself. I'm the person who you can come to when the discomfort starts up again. Like just mechanisms to be able to really like assure folks that we're there, not to be in opposition to people, I think is huge.
Thank you, Jane, Terrence, and Anuj for building and providing us with such concrete examples of success in building and really responses, especially outside of many of our systems and spaces. It's really wonderful to see. Thank you. Another question. We are running out of time and space, but I still think it's really important to ask the question, what are some of the key challenges or misunderstandings of RJ, and how have you overcome them?
I mean, I think like it's a movement that's growing quite fast. And it's interesting to watch a movement that is like rooted in slow process have like a high demand on it. Like I think that that's a challenge. Also say every challenge I can think of, like my solution is like through community, you know, it's like everything is done through community. I think like community and relationships and places of care, which also like that's why like I think I just have like an affinity for CACF because it's also a place where we can think about all of these processes within family systems, which is a space where there's just like so much potential for restoration. Yeah, I think, you know, we have this group called the Youth Advocacy Council, which is a group of young people within RJI. And I had written a college recommendation letter for one of them yesterday. And this young person, like when she speaks, you can tell that she's like carrying the spirit of like all of the people in her lineage with her. Like she talks so powerfully about the impact of the lineage of her family on how she moves through the world. And I wrote down this question, like, what is the community of your healing journey? Like, even if you're walking through, like walking into a room alone, like, what are the other energies and spirits of people who you are carrying with you? And for me, like a lot of the things that have been tough in this work, I like come back to this question of like, well, what is the community of this healing journey that I am on? And how do I move from that remembrance, that like larger spirit, through the challenges of the work? And some of those challenges are like being asked to move at the pace of punitive systems, which like punitive systems, they like effectively work to punish because they're quick. And so like there's like we can't conform what we do as RJ practitioners to the speed of the world around us. It just doesn't work. And also I think like there for me is like this growing thing that I have to work through within myself of like there's so much information out there on what restorative justice is and isn't, and even remembering not to like respond to what I disagree with opposition. And that's really hard. That's really hard in like movement building, to not want to respond through opposition and be like, how do we grow a new definition? How do we grow a stronger definition? How do we grow stronger processes together? Yeah, I think those are some of the things that come up in my mind. And honestly, like sorry, I'm just like blabbing now, but another big challenge is living in a city right now where like oftentimes like we talk about safety on a larger level through a single entity, and like that entity holds a tremendous amount of systemic power and has a really like strong unbreakable union. Like I just think about what it means to live in a city with such a tremendously large police force, and to advocate for a practice that is about like interdependence and every single person in a community holding the responsibility of safety to one another. Like it's just a bummer to have to spend like 30% of my job advocating for like why this work should exist, rather than like this like dream community where it's like we can just do the thing. So that's another challenge, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, I was gonna say like the lack of community that I see with a lot of people that I talk to, you know, like not everyone is embedded in like a context that they feel really comfortable in. And then you see them in a vulnerable moment and they're reaching out and they, you know, like they're feeling that absence kind of like consciously in a way that they may not like in a day-to-day life. But Anuj reminded me of something really great when he's talking about like his own healing journey and his own community, that it doesn't have to like look a certain way. So like something that is positive is like, even if someone's not super engaged in an organization or doesn't know their neighbors or whatever it is, they may have people in their life that like are not at all kind of like front of mind, but that they could build a stronger relationship with, or who has showed up with for them in some kind of small way that is like a seed of something that can be good. So I feel like for example, like I talked to somebody who's like in a neighborhood experiencing some racial harassment and like kind of like close to an Asian enclave, but like immediately not, and didn't feel like they could really talk to anybody like kind of like who knew this person who was harassing them, whatever. And then I just kind of like said, like, is there anyone who's like not Asian who you think like might kind of have your ear on it? And they were like, you know, like, oh, I hadn't really thought about it that way, right? But like there are kind of these little pieces where it's like an opportunity can present itself, you know. So I think that's one cool thing that it just reminded me of, even though most of the time I'm like, oh my God, what is the community? How do we make it stronger? Like, how do we get people more engaged in it?
Yeah, I mean, the list of frustrations are long, and I don't know how much time we have to engage in the litany of them. I think one of the frustrations is the perception of what restorative practices are. That it's this some kind of that it's that it sort of lacks a rigor and a discipline, and it's very sort of, you know, abstract and touchy-feely, you know, that's emotionally driven. And that feeds sort of in the next frustration, which is how it continues to get hammered by sort of that Western Eurocentric paradigm of reducing things to numbers and sort of segments, and that its value is somehow equated with how much money, how much revenue it can drive, or what are the data points? Like, show me the evidence of impact. How many students are not being suspended? How is it, you know, how many women are being positively impacted that may be suffering from domestic violence? And it's just not, it does a disservice to the work and the people doing the work. And my fear is that there will be a moment where there will be sort of like art in the cult of personality. There'll be RJ celebrities that emerge. I mean, that doesn't really exist, I think, yet. But this notion that this kind of like restorative stars, these will emerge that, you know, that people must go to. And I'm not talking about, and that's different from sort of expertise, right? There are people that are highly competent doing the work. But I think I see some head nodding. So I know I think I know what people, I compare it to, historically, I compare it to hip hop, right? So the genesis of hip hop and rap music, people really didn't know, right? So like the credibility was earned through the messaging and the style, you know, the way that, you know, people were able to, you know, spit bars, as they say. And I think we're sort of at that moment now, which is sacrosanct for me, you know, just, you know, people that do the work with sort of a real commitment and sort of fidelity to certain values. But it's always that sort of, it's always the challenge of sort of monetizing the value for me, which is challenging. And I think the thinking that goes into that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Terrence, Jane, and Anuj once again. And Terrence, the data-driven metrics, Anuj, what we're up against in terms of punitive systems and the sheer size of not just NYPD, but the whole criminal legal systems. And Jane, thank you for sharing both the challenges as well as some of the positives that you see that healing can look different as well. Our last question, and of course we are hearing from the audience as well, but tell us about ways that we can incorporate, that RJ is in us, and so that we can incorporate RJ perhaps in our own work and spaces. And obviously we will reach out to you experts later on. This is a longer term conversation, but some things that you have seen in terms of basic steps, or some things that you are seeing in the movement building for how we could incorporate restorative justice in our own work or spaces.
I mean, you know, I think because restorative justice can look like so many things, and the question of like, well, where do I start can feel like a really complicated one. A frequent question I ask folks is like, what do your closest relationships look like right now? And like, how do you build community within those relationships? How do you respond to conflict within those relationships? I think in our closest relationships, that's like the most abundant proof of how restorative justice looks within us, between those of us we're in community with. So I think that's always a question of like, what, like in your relationships of care and compassion, what are the like, what are the tools you use to like really make sure that that relationship has continuity? And thinking about what it looks like to take aspects of that in community at large. I think, you know, I think another part is like making time for conversation's sake. Like a huge part of this is that like we're allowed to come together and storytell and dialogue without having to like name it as productive, like where we can just come together and storytell and create moments of exchange, and that's okay. So I think those are a couple of things that come to mind. And that like the language of restorative justice and anti-violence only gets easier by like practicing it together. And so if you're feeling unknown of where to go next, like name the question you're wondering, name the unknowns, and then share it with people and make it a conversation.
Yeah, I would encourage people to exercise their cultural palettes. So I'm not saying you have to be a cultural linguist necessarily, but expose yourself to really expose yourself to something different, and not just going to a different, you know, cultural restaurant, right? And I'm not trying to be glib, right? I mean, they're just such a wealth of opportunities to expose yourself to different ways of experiencing and seeing the world. And I think that by initiating that, by taking the initiative to expose oneself, that's a good beginning. And then think about what are the shared, like when you're in spaces with people who are different from you, really start to examine and interrogate some of the values that are ricocheting off of each other. And then, you know, discuss like, you know, community agreements, right? Start documenting that and posting it. You know, we're complex human beings, right? And life seems to get more complex as we get older. So it can be challenging to embrace something that seems so simple. But I think there's some clarity in embracing some things that are simple. And I also think, you know, asking questions, you know, really try to maintain a curiosity about whom you're in community with. And and don't allow mistakes to, to mitigate a certain kind of risk that is required in being in community with people different from themselves. And the final thing is accept invitations. When people invite you to stuff, say yes. And you can't always, but it's nice to accept an invitation, because when you say no, you already know what's going to happen, right? You're not going to, you'll probably just lean into the familiar. But when you say yes, there's just so many different possibilities that you're availing yourself to that could lead to something positive. And I think that as you try to find ways to create some kind of, like, to organize these experiences, I think that something that Jane and Anuj spoke to about how it lives inside of you, that thing will be, I think it will be like a pilot light that will be lit for, and there'll be a predilection to be more inclined to functioning in a restorative way, because you'll want these things to sort of function in harmony with each other.
I guess agree with all of that from both of you. And yeah, I think to like build on, or be maybe more, build on what Anuj said, is like looking at your closest relationships. Yeah, like I have no doubt that like everybody in this meeting right now, like some form of tension or harm that has like at some point recently occurred, like in a community that you're in. And I think, like, I'm not saying everybody has to like get up and do something about it, but it's like think about it, like, how did you react to it? How did others react to it? Does it seem like there could be a need that wasn't met by someone? I mean, it's happening all the time. I think another thing is like all of us commit harm, all of us have experienced harm to different degrees, and all of us are capable of committing serious harm, I think, for sure. And so I like looking at that and how it occurs like in your life, and how you and the people you're in community with respond to it. Just being more attuned to that, I think, is important.
Thank you so much, Anuj, Jane, and Terrence. We are coming to the end of our wonderful time together, and we really appreciate how you've given us just concrete ways to think about our own relationships, our own communities, both in conflict and also in love, which are not opposed, and how we can build on that together. Thank you so much. At this time, I'm going to just pass it over to Vanessa and Anita, but I've learned a lot. I've definitely leaned into a lot of discomfort, and I always think that just circle process and RJ methods are an amazing way of being together. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront once again, all three of you.
So I want to really thank all of you for really being part of this discussion. I know I've learned so much, and there's so many of these takeaways and nuggets for how we can approach and be really more really in harmony. So I'm just going to share that this webinar will be, it is recorded. And so we will share this on our website, so you can find us. And I just want to thank again, Josie. This has been a process, a collaborative process within your guidance and leadership through this, to get us through this wonderful discussion. And then Anuj, Jane, and Terrence, so grateful for you all to share your wisdom with us this evening, and then really thinking about how we come into this space. And I know all of us can really reflect, and I know we'll hear from folks about how this can, how we can be more helpful in creating this shared learning space. So grateful again. Thank you all for joining, and we will be in touch. Take care, all.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
So much. Bye-bye, everyone. Be safe.
Bye. Thank
Peace and
you.
blessings, everyone. Thank you.
Rashida. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all. It was a privilege.
Right. I think we can